talk about the subject matter today, and that's the two battles of Copenhagen, 1801 and 1807, which you can find on Amazon or any decent bookstore. And Gareth, what kind of led you to write about these two battles? What makes them particularly interesting?
Well, they're famous or infamous, should I say, at the same time, for many reasons. The main reasons are the 1801 naval battle is Nelson's second victory of the three great victories he had in his career, although it's the hardest fought and probably the most dubious victory of the three. And which we'll get into further, I'm sure. And at 1807, to be honest, it's more famous within Britain for the Duke of Wellington's, or Arthur Wellesley as he was then, his first victory in Europe.
Yeah, it's interesting, both battles. And, one of them, the first one was almost a near run thing for the Danes. They almost won that one. And then the second one, I would say, is more controversial, but we'll jump into that. Yeah, regarding the 1801 battle, I was reading up on it before we jumped on, and Nelson said it was the fiercest battle he ever fought, and he was in over 100 battles. Why was it particularly brutal, this one?
Well, it was very close quarters, like most of the battles, but one of the things that helped the Danes is that they were anchored, so they obviously were only considering having to fire the guns as fast as they possibly could. They weren't having to maneuver ship and everything else. The other thing is that they were so close to shore that they were constantly replenishing the men. So if they were either wounded, killed, or just absolutely worn out and had to be exchanged, they could set a new crew on board very quickly and continue the fight, which obviously means, it's something the Brits couldn't do. And therefore it gave them one advantage, should we say.
Okay. Well, let's give some background on that first attack. What was the situation in Europe at this time? I know we're going to talk about the League of Armed Neutrality, but what kind of was happening in 1801?
Well, 1801 is obviously a period when Britain are largely standing alone against France. They've had numerous sort of allies who have come and gone on a regular basis, and now the Russians, who have been friendly for a long time, are actually starting to change their mind. Tsar Paul has decided that Napoleon has brought some stability to France, so he's not as anti-France as he was when it was a revolutionary country, and therefore it meant that Britain didn't have a huge number of allies, but the Baltic, and I've actually mentioned this quite a bit in the book, and to explain is the Baltic was really seen as a bit of a sideshow for the British. They weren't really interested in it, apart from the fact that that's where all their naval stores came from. So if they wanted new masts, etc., they were coming out of either Russia or Sweden and Finland, etc.
The timber for the masts.
Yes, the timber for the mast. Sorry, yes. So while this was freely coming in and out, the British really didn't have anything to do with the Baltic. And in fact, the Royal Navy hadn't actually put a ship into the Baltic for many, many decades. There was no need to. It was all running quite smoothly. And then suddenly, the Danes and the Swedes, who had been trying to sort of run their sort of merchant navy on the basis of being neutrals, but actually bending every single rule and sort of therefore supplying the French, for example, when the Brits are actually at war with them. So they're not really being neutral, but they decide that they are going to start escorting their ships, their merchant ships around the place with their own navies, because the Brits are starting to say, hang on a minute, you're constantly breaking the rules, you're supplying our enemies, etc. That's not neutrality as far as we're concerned.
Right.
So it starts the ball rolling of the Danes and the Swedes just starting to say, well, hang on a minute, we want to stop you boarding our ships and stop you taking our ships. But the Brits at the same time clearly challenging them over that. And it starts that ball rolling that inevitably ends up with a war, because Denmark, who have a very strong navy, I mean, they are. I've described them as a second-rate European country at that period in time, but having a first-rate navy. In fact, they had the fifth biggest navy in Europe at the time,
Right.
which was actually used very much as a diplomatic arm. It was their strength in the navy was how they actually portrayed themselves and made sure that they were listened to, basically.
Right.
And that was important. But of course, when Denmark and Sweden then realize that the Brits are upset, and of course Britain has the biggest navy by far in the world at the time, they then start talking to the Russians. But of course, that means the Russians want them to become the armed neutrality, which is a pact which has happened before. And what that does is it gives, for Russia, brilliantly, it actually gives buffer states in front of it, who the enemy has to get through to get to them. And as they're starting to turn towards the French and away from the British, this looks quite unsurprisingly sort of popular with the Russians. But it clearly puts Denmark, particularly, in the front line, because they're actually sitting right in the strait of the entrance to the Baltic, and you have to go, through the narrow channel between Sweden and Denmark to get into the Baltic. And of course, with Denmark particularly sitting right across that entrance, the Brits are going to look at any very strong navy at that particular point as being the biggest threat to them actually having free access to the Baltic.
Right. And I'm glad you mentioned that Denmark had the fifth biggest navy at the time. So this wasn't going to be a pushover for the British Navy. This was going to be a good battle.
Absolutely not. Yeah. I mean, obviously, although we would say that, they had 20 odd ships of the line and Britain had over 100. Obviously, Britain has huge worldwide commitments and can't easily put together a fleet of 20 odd ships to go into the Baltic. So a fleet of 20 warships is quite significant. The other thing is the Danes spent a fortune on their fleet. They had probably the best system of keeping their ships in mothball, ready to sail at a reasonably short notice in the world. I mean, they spent an absolute fortune on it. They even had up to 5,000 sailors, even when the fleet wasn't being used, paid and equipped, just sitting around with their families in Copenhagen, waiting for the call,
Right.
so they could actually man the ships very quickly. It was a serious fleet. And obviously, on top of that, if you go to the armed neutrality, you are starting to talk over 50 major warships between Denmark, Sweden, and Russia.
Yeah. Yeah, let's talk about the commanders and number of ships on each side of this first battle. It looks like 12 ships of the line for the British and 9 for the Danes, along with supporting vessels. I'd like to talk about Ulfert Fischer of the Danes, who actually knew Nelson, right? He had met him before.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. Well, regarding the ship numbers, you've got to be a little bit careful, because obviously it was about 18 ships of the line that turned up at Copenhagen off the coast there. But the channel through there is actually quite shallow, and the bigger British warships up to 100 guns couldn't actually maneuver in most of the area, because even the 74 gunners, which is the mid-range sort of ship of the line at that time, even they were in danger of touching the bottom on a regular basis. So it was, you had to be very careful where you went with these ships. So, but the Brits actually do attack. Nelson is given 12 ships to attack the Danish line. But in fact, 3 of those run aground, as I said, because of the shallow ground. So in fact, he actually ends up attacking with 9. And you're quite right in saying that, there were less Danish vessels. There were 9 major vessels, but they weren't as well gunned as the British. But when you say supporting vessels, that almost sounds like that they're not actually particularly well armed. In fact, the 20 ships that were actually, including small vessels that were actually in the Danish line, had 386 guns on them.
Oh
And then
wow.
you had shore guns on top of that firing
Right.
as well at the British, whereas the British 9 vessels that actually went in had just over 300 guns. So in fact, because of the 3 ships being left stranded on the side, the actual number of guns was in favor of the Danes.
Right. So Fisher's strategy then is to kind of get the, I guess, the field guns on the shore as well as the supporting gun vessels to make up any lack of difference in ships. Correct.
Yes, and you've got obviously the Trachona Battery, which, if anybody ever been to Copenhagen, it lies in the entrance to the harbour, a huge sort of fortress that was being built in the harbour to protect it, and that was carrying around over 50 guns as well. So there was some serious gunnery in the area, and plus, as you said, a number of shore batteries, etc. So yeah, and the whole idea is that this reserve fleet, you must remember is actually there to take the sting out of the British attack, because in fact the actual main Danish fleet, their main ships, are actually sat in harbour being protected by this second fleet of old vessels, etc., they're using to actually fight the battle.
Right. And then on the British side, we have the famous Horatio Nelson, who was just emerged from a huge victory at the Battle of the Nile over the
Yeah.
French. What made him a singular talent, in your opinion?
Oh, undoubtedly. I mean, even today in the Royal Navy, the Britain's Royal Navy, he actually is still seen as one of those naval commanders to aspire to be. Basically, he had a fantastic ability to lead his officers and men into quite, should we say, difficult situations, but also bring them out with victories. And the main reason he did that, he was always prepared to take serious risks.
Right.
I mean, many of his actual battles are astounding for their actual audacity in many ways, and it actually inspired many other naval officers. And the British Navy of this period is actually full of literally hundreds of occasions where you think they've got no chance of winning, and yet they do because of their audacious attack, should we say. And it's really him that inspires that in a great deal.
Sounds a little like a guy named Napoleon.
Yes, not unlike, yeah, yeah, they are very, very different characters, but they certainly on the battlefield, they have very similar abilities, should we say, on different parts of the world, should we say.
Oh, indeed. Yeah. But I think going back to your central trait, that they have the ability to inspire those around them to go above and beyond and do things that people wouldn't expect them to do.
No, exactly.
But the 1801 battle begins with the British Navy setting up a blockade around Copenhagen. What kind of happens from there?
Yeah, well, the blockade is to obviously to sort of try to trap the Danish fleet, but they need to get at the main Danish fleet, and that the problem, as I've said to you, they're ensconced in the harbour, staying as a real threat to the British, even if they actually defeat the defensive forces in front of them. This is with only fighting the reserve fleet, as I say, with these older ships, and it requires Nelson to actually attack these ships in as I say, they are in a position where they are set in position by anchors and sort of ropes, etc., so that they can't move. And so that the only thing they have to do is to fire their guns as fast as they possibly can and just keep going as much as they can. Whereas the Royal Navy has this problem of actually having to go through quite a narrow channel, try to avoid any further ships going ashore, etc., and to slowly destroy this fleet of, as you say, some major battleships, but at the same time, a number of smaller ships which have open decks, basically just flat decks, which have just had guns added onto them,
Right.
which unsurprisingly, although they've gone down in sort of Danish folklore history as being, sort of these brave men on these open decks fighting against the British Navy were actually knocked out of the battle very, very quickly, unsurprisingly.
Yeah. Yeah, and the British encounter stiff resistance, and I guess Admiral Parker, who's kind of running the show, signals for Nelson to retreat with his ship. And Nelson famously holds the telescope over his blind eye and says he can't see the signal to retreat and continues firing. Was this apocryphal, or did this really happen?
No, it really happened. We've got witnesses to state that they saw him do it. Yeah, Hyde Parker, as you say, he could see the battle was very intense, thought that it may require the Navy to pull out and think again. So he puts up signal 39, which is the order to retire. But Nelson maintain, as you say, he puts the telescope to the blind eye, says he can't see the signal, and orders basically his ship to actually not repeat the signal to retire, but to actually say to continue to engage, which is quite an interesting one, because that clearly puts Nelson in quite a difficult situation if things had gone wrong, because he's obviously now gone against orders and could be court-martialed and even drummed out of the Navy. He has to be certain he's actually going to succeed.
Yeah, no, it's a bold risk on his side, but as usual, Nelson was right. But interesting, around the time though that spear gunnery of the British begins to turn the tide, how does the fighting kind of wrap up?
Well, it wraps up as, obviously, as I said to you, a lot of the smaller vessels, open decks, etc., are forced out of the fight quite quickly, many of them within the first 15, 20 minutes. But some of the other bigger ships are, put up a serious fight, and one or two of the British ships take on quite large casualties. I mean, one ship actually has nearly a third of its crew either killed or wounded. So, they are taking serious losses themselves, and they slowly move up the line and overpower each of the ships as they go up, with the intention of even having to attack Dracona Battery at the end, which would have been quite an interesting feat, which was going to be done by the ship's boats, trying to land the Marines on there.
Right.
But before that happens, Nelson decided to send in a note to the Prince Regent, who was actually in sort of looking after this of the country after the king, like the King of Britain was also having mental problems, and therefore that they had their Prince Regent in charge as well. So he sends in a letter, basically sort of saying that he can see how many people are being killed, and rather than see any more poor Danes dying in battle when there's no point fighting anymore, that they should sort of give up now and sort of admit defeat. It doesn't happen exactly like that, and it takes a good hour or so before the prince eventually agrees with an armistice. And certainly, although Nelson is very keen to say he does it on the back of just not wanting to see further useless loss of life, there are good reasons to believe that Nelson also knows they've still got to go into Baltic and face the Russians, right. And his fleet is taking quite serious damage, to the point where he's thinking, we need to try to end this as soon as possible and move on, basically giving us still some ships so we can take into the Baltic.
Yeah, it's considered a victory for the British, but it was a close battle with both sides inflicting at least 1,200 casualties on the other. The Danes lose 3 ships of the line, sunk or destroyed, and another 6 captured. What do you think the aftermath is? Because I imagine there's probably some hurt feelings amongst the Danes.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the Danes hated the Brits for it, although they, for the next 4 or 5 years until 5-6 years up until 1807, they go back to a relatively amicable sort of agreement where they will continue to allow the Danes to be neutral and the Brits to leave them alone. That's after Nelson has taken the fleet into the Baltic, But the big game changer there is that while the Danes are in this situation where they don't want to be seen to be giving up the League of Armed Neutrality, because the Tsar of Russia will not be happy with them. Paul will be very upset. They are delaying the negotiations as much as possible, whereas Nelson and Parker are actually desperately trying to get an agreement with the Danes that they're going to stay out of any fighting going forward, so they can move on against the Russians. But it all comes to a massive change when news arrives that Tsar Paul has actually been killed. There's been a coup, thought to be actually helped by his own son that takes over, Alexander. And this means that the Danes now can, not knowing exactly what Alexander thinks about the Brits, but thinking, well, with all the confusion of Russia now, they're not going to be looking at us too much. We can come to an agreement with the British, and they have basically a 14-week truce, basically, where neither side will fight for that 14 weeks, allowing Nelson to move into the Baltic. And obviously the Danes hoping that everything will calm down by the time that time is up. And it's in fact what happens, because Alexander is more pro-British and less pro-French. So they swing back towards being friendly with the Russians, and therefore the armed neutrality quietly dies an exact death, which is what the Brits want. But it's not really happened because of the success at Copenhagen. It's happened really because of Paul's sudden death.
Yeah, it sounds like a classic case of gunboat diplomacy, where you can be neutral as long as you do what we say. If you don't, we're going to send in our ships again.
Well, yes, but as I said, you've got to also look at the other side. You're right. I mean, because it can look as if it's just the Brits sort of being very sort of overbearing on everybody else. But you have to bear in mind that the Danes were making an absolute fortune by breaking the neutrality rules on every occasion possible. Right. They were selling false documents. They were allowing ships for a fee to fly their flag, even though they weren't Danish, so that they were allowing other countries, particularly France, to flout some of the actual rules that were brought in because of their supposed neutrality. But as I said, so it's you have to look at it on both sides. I mean, both sides were playing games, should we say?
Yeah, and that kind of leads us to 1807, the next Battle of Copenhagen. This one's, I think, is even harder for the Danes because, obviously Napoleon's conquering everything on the continent at this point.
Yeah.
So for them to say no to him would be very dangerous. But at the same time, in their minds, they're thinking 1801, we just had a savage battle with the British. We don't want to do that again. So they're probably stuck between a rock and a hard place, wouldn't you say?
Well, they had been for about the best part of 80 odd years. Denmark had actually been very clever in walking that tightrope, in not actually getting involved in any of the wars. And if you think about the 1700s, literally Europe was continually at war somewhere. Yeah, it literally went from one war, and then a couple of years later, be another war, and another year, another war. It just kept going on. And the Danes managed to, through diplomacy and an awful lot of guile, should we say, and sort of doing stuff behind the scenes or whatever. But at the end of the day, they managed to just walk that little tightrope all the time and not have to produce troops or get into fighting on either side. And they played this neutral game throughout the period and made an absolute fortune. As I said, and it was the golden age in Denmark. They really were seeing things dramatically change. And Copenhagen is an example. And I give some examples of that in the book, and you can see all these fine buildings being built throughout the 1700s, as the Danes are showing off their success and their ability to make money. But what it does also do is it makes them quite arrogant. It makes them believe that they have identified a way of being better than everybody else in avoiding war and making money out of all these idiots who are actually fighting each other. And slowly over time, that becomes a problem. And it does become a huge problem at this stage, because by 1807, you have Napoleon looking to get ships wherever he can. He's just beaten the Russians, the Prussians are already defeated, and the Austrians. So he's got largely control of Europe. But what he doesn't have, he has the power on land. He hasn't got the power at sea. And therefore he needs to now find a way to increase his fleet dramatically, so he can actually challenge the Royal Navy again, and at the same time also ensure that Denmark and all these other countries who are neutral are also not being guilty of allowing British goods into Europe, which they were, because that's the other side of the coin. They were also playing the game with Brits and allowing them to allow stuff into Europe when the Berlin decrees, etc., had basically said that Europe was a closed door to British trade. And obviously Britain this time relied on trade to make money, to therefore pay for his army and his navy. And Denmark was one of the areas where it was getting through. The Danes knew about it. They basically lied to Napoleon and his diplomats, basically saying no, it wasn't happening, but it was happening. So they were playing a game on both sides, and they had eventually got to the point where Napoleon makes threats of saying that they need to basically make a decision on which side they are. Right. And at the same time, you've got the Brits saying, Napoleon is after your fleet. Give us your fleet and we'll look after it in safety, while you cannot look after it yourself because you can't defend yourself against Napoleon.
Right. And that's an interesting overview, because there is a continental system where Napoleon only wants trade within the continent, not with Britain. At the same time, Britain says, hey, look, we know Napoleon just lost a large portion of his navy at Trafalgar. You have a navy, Denmark. We're just going to keep a safe eye on it here in Britain during this war. So again, it must have been a hard decision for the Danes to make on which way to go.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, and they still, to be honest, wanted to tread that line up the middle. They still thought there was a way they could do it. And I've tried to say in the book that the inevitability was coming, that they were going to have to choose a side sometime. It was going to become impossible to continue this game of trying to please both sides at the same time. But because it's not just Denmark, the other two countries who are doing something similar with regards to a sort of neutrality situation and allowing trade and goods in from the Britain into the European system are both Portugal and Sweden. Right. And at this moment in time, Napoleon does launch an attack against Portugal to try and capture that fleet, which again makes the Brits think, okay, well, they managed to persuade the Portuguese to take their fleet out before it gets taken, and they sail off to Brazil into safety. And then they're looking at Copenhagen as well and thinking, well, the Danish fleet is under huge threat here, with a French army literally on the borders of Holstein, where the Danish army is also standing to make sure they don't come in. And it is, as far as the British are concerned, it's a very severe threat that these ships are going to be used by the French, and that will increase the French ability to challenge the British Navy at sea.
All right. Well, let's discuss the numbers on each side in this particular battle. The British has about 25,000 soldiers and sailors, including one Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. And the Danes have about 10,000 troops. What's different from this one versus the previous 1801 battle?
Well, the first thing is that in 1801, Copenhagen city, and where the actual Danish fleet was kept within the actual city, was within bombarding distance of mortars out at sea. After 1801, the Danes, who had known there had been a threat because they didn't have enough defenses along the coastline there to keep the foreign navies far enough away. They'd known this for decades, but had never actually got round to spending the money to do it. But after 1801, they realized they had to spend the money, and they built a number of major forts and finished Trachona Battery, etc., along the coastline. And it now made it virtually impossible for the Royal Navy to get close enough to actually bombard Copenhagen from the sea. So this time round, it is obvious from the start that it cannot be a sea campaign alone. Their troops are going to have to be landed on Zealand Island and actually threaten Copenhagen from the land side, because that is less strong than the actual naval side now. And that's why this time the actual fleet is sent across with a large army with it, and 25,000 for the Brits at this time was quite a sizable army to deploy here. And that they were specifically designed knowing that it was going to have to be Copenhagen was going to have to be taken from the land side. You couldn't attack it from the sea anymore.
Got it. And the Danes end up rejecting the British demands, so the battle is on. What happens from there?
Well, the troops get landed in Zealand, which is the island. They surround, or sort of cut off the actual sort of the city from supplies from outside, and that includes their sort of big gunpowder factory at Frederiksværk, etc. So they're a bit short of gunpowder. They also Copenhagen also has 3 large reservoirs that's just outside the city walls, so we're able to actually cut them off as well and cut the pipes, which actually meant that the water supply to the city got quite restricted, although they had a number of wells, etc. But they were able to cut it off completely, although they had to keep troops in reserve and keep an eye, because they didn't know if the main Danish force that was down in Holstein on the mainland was going to return and try to attack them in the rear. So there was always that fear that there would be this relieving force appearing in the distance. But basically, it became very clear very quickly that they could not cut off the city from all supplies, because there's an island on the other side of the where they could still get supplies from, and it was going to be a long drawn out blockade, which was not a situation the British forces wanted to be in, because obviously you had both the Danish and a French army which could link up and both come to Zealand in the near future, and therefore they wanted to get things over quickly. And it was decided that the only way to do that was to bombard the city, as they refused to surrender quickly.
Yeah, and we'll come back to this in the legacy. So the city is firebombed. In theory, Denmark was a neutral country, so the British are going to get condemned for this action. But it ends up the battle being more lopsided, and Denmark agrees to surrender its navy and naval stores. Do you think it was a war crime, or is it hard to look at the lens that we look at it now?
It is. It's very difficult, because I view it very similar to the decision that Winston Churchill had to make with the Vichy Navy of France in 1941, wasn't it? Where he had to attack their main fleet out in the Mediterranean, because he was more concerned about it becoming available to the German Navy than allowing it to actually stay, as it was trying to claim, neutral. And it's a very similar situation. It is a difficult argument in it, and you can argue both sides, and both are valid. It is attacking a neutral country, but I suppose what the Brits would argue is that they had made attempts to say to that neutral country, you can see the threat from Napoleon. He wants your fleet. He's coming to get it. If you don't give it to us, and we'll keep it in safekeeping for you safely elsewhere, we can't allow you to let him have it.
Yeah, it's the lesser of two evils.
Yes.
We have to attack Copenhagen But the bigger evil is if Napoleon gets your navy and then attacks, mainland Britain, and then we have a even bigger war on our hands.
Yes, yes.
Okay. So, as I said, the aftermath is more interesting, I think, in this one, as the British are widely condemned for this action by other countries.
Mm-hmm.
The Danes suffer 3,000 casualties to the British 200. The legacy of the two battles also coins a term which is called Copenhagenization, which means to deliver a decisive blow to a navy while it is anchored in its home port. What do you think the legacy of these two attacks, or two battles, I should say, are?
The primary sort of legacy was that the Danes, after the second attack, immediately allied themselves with Napoleon and were actually his most staunch enemy. And in fact, Denmark was the last country to abandon its alliance with France in 1814. So once they were on his side, they were there wholeheartedly, although obviously they didn't have the navy they had.
Right.
The Danes, I mean, there's a few things. The Danes actually then chose not to rebuild a fleet of huge ships anymore. It decided instead to actually build small gunboats, because one of the things that with as I said, with regard to Copenhagen, is one is a narrow channel to get past, and two, the Baltic, and I've seen it myself in the Navy, is you at times get no wind at all. I have seen the Baltic literally looking out for dozens of miles around, and it is like a sheet of glass, absolute sheet of glass. And in those situations, it doesn't matter how big a warship you are very vulnerable if you have no ability to maneuver, because
Right.
these gunboats with their oars can move around you and can overpower and fire at you at your weak points, etc. And that's how they then carried on quite a what they call gunboat, the gunboat war, which went on right the way through to 1814, which caused the Brits quite a lot of pain and anguish in having to sort of convoy their ships through, etc., to ensure they didn't. But the other thing it did do, which is a huge one, is that it had a huge economic effect on Denmark. And in fact, in 1813, Denmark basically crashed. It sort of went insolvent. So therefore, its economy had gone completely. And the other thing that it cost quite, because one of the things we haven't mentioned, but it's quite important to understand, Denmark was not just Denmark. Denmark actually consisted then of Norway, which is actually a joint kingdom. It wasn't subordinate by Denmark. It was actually of the same rank. Also Greenland, etc. And in 1814, because Denmark had been such a staunch ally of Napoleon, and Sweden had been such a staunch ally of Britain in fighting against him, that in fact Sweden is given Norway. So Denmark is basically halved in size, and it's on his knees economically.
The British in 1807, they accomplished their goal. They got the navy and the naval stores away from Denmark.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, they created such bitter feelings that it gave Napoleon one of their staunchest allies. It's very interesting to me.
Yeah, no, it is. And I suppose the only thing is you have to accept the fact that it is a very weakened Denmark that is now an ally of Napoleon. As far as the British are concerned, the navy, which is the most important thing, is not a threat. And the gunboat war, although it's a pain in the neck for the Brits, is actually not going to cause them serious concern. And their army is not of a size that is going to make a huge difference to the war that is still fighting across Europe. So, yes, it has caused them to go to that side and stay there staunchly, but it's not a huge country going into that position. As I say, their navy was way oversized for their ability, for the size of the country, should we say, even before things had happened. And once the economy crashed, clearly there was no ability to maintain a large army, and no even intention of replacing the large navy again.
Yeah, and they lose Norway to boot at the end of it. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. But I would point out one other thing is on the British side, specifically 1807, it's actually not. It was a bit of an embarrassment even for the Brits. Within Britain, there are very few sort of celebrations. There's not huge public joy over it. In fact, you get Turner, for example, did a painting which included the two of the Danish prize vessels arriving in Britain, and he had to rename it because people didn't like it. And there was no medal produced for 1807 either. There was for 1801, but in 1807 there was never a medal given to the army or the navy for what they did, which was very unusual. So it clearly shows that, you know, everyone in Britain was very uncomfortable about it, including King George III, who was very uncomfortable with what had gone on.
And the diplomatic outcry probably didn't help anything either. The other countries saying you shouldn't have done that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Because the Russians were particularly unhappy about it, which we were trying to get back on our side again, because they'd switched sides again. As you know, the Russians changed sides quite a lot during these long wars. But as you say, yeah, it didn't go down well across Europe. But I suppose Napoleon probably did Britain a favor, because there were many things he did that didn't go down too well with Europe as well. So in time, Britain and its bankrolling abilities were brought it back into the mainstream, should we say?
Yeah, and like you said, it launched Wellington's career in Europe, so that part was good for him.
Yeah. Although I would actually say, be honest, if you actually look at the battle at Cog, which he actually won there, to be perfectly honest, it was again, it was no real battle at all. I mean, he was actually up against militiamen. They, a couple of shots were fired and they ran. It's everybody there, who's an eyewitness admits basically it was over in minutes. So it's not a huge victory, but it gets remembered as well as his first victory in Europe. But to be fair to him, he never really referred to it ever again. It wasn't seen by him as anything special, let's put it that way.
Yeah. Well, very interesting, those two battles. I really appreciate that overview. For those who want to learn more about Gareth, again, he has several books on Amazon from the era. And again, this one, The Two Battles of Copenhagen, I recommend you take a look at. And Gareth, it was a pleasure having you on the call.
Oh, pleasure. Have me again anytime you want.
Absolutely will.